The chamber didn't just quiet down, it tightened. Like every pair of eyes in the building had been dragged into the orbit of one man. Senator Cole Maddox, war hero, man of the people, king of cable news soundbites in an expensive Navy suit. He leaned back in his leather chair with the lazy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime being told the room belonged to him. The cameras caught the flag pin on his lapel, the perfectly combed silver hair, the smirk that never quite reached his eyes. That smirk wasn't warmth. It was possession, as if the committee, the witnesses, even the country itself, were just props on the stage of his career. He cleared his throat, leaned toward the mic with the casual arrogance of a man who thinks microphones exist to amplify his ego, and delivered the line that would light a match under the whole hearing. "I respect your concern," he said, stretching the word like it was something fragile in his mouth. "But you clearly don't understand national security. It's the way adults in this room do. Some of us have actually bled for this flag." Few people chuckled, small, awkward bursts of sound from those trained to laugh when power tells them what's funny. But the cameras weren't on them. They were on the woman sitting across from him, Dr. Aisha Rahman, public health researcher, daughter of immigrants, the quiet force whose report had triggered an investigation into the detention centers no one wanted to talk about. She didn't move, didn't roll her eyes, didn't shrink. Instead, she folded her hands, slow and deliberate, the posture of someone who has spent a lifetime surviving men who confuse volume with wisdom. Her eyes stayed on him, calm and steady, and something shifted. Not in her. She was anchored in the room, in the air, in the certainty Cole Maddox wore like armor, because everyone watching felt the same thing at the same time. That smirk? He was going to regret it. What no one on that panel knew, not the senior staffers, not the reporters glued to their screens, not even Maddox himself, was that this one dismissive moment would become the spark that flipped the script. And Aisha, she was nowhere near finished. The laughter wasn't real. It wasn't relaxed. It wasn't respectful. It was the brittle nervousness of people who weren't sure if they'd just witnessed leadership or bullying. A few senators exchanged side glances. No one stepped, and no one called it out. This was Cole Maddox's favorite ecosystem, a room where silence defaulted to his side. The cameras obeyed old instincts. Too, they swiveled toward him automatically, zooming in on the decorated veteran whose war stories and patriotic speeches had made him a star. Every lens, every angle, every operator trained like satellites tracking their son. He bathed in it. For a moment, Maddox genuinely believed he had won the room with a single patronizing swipe. But the real shift, the one history would remember, it didn't start with him. It started with her, Dr. Aisha. Rahman didn't fidget. She didn't scramble to defend herself. She didn't offer nervous laughter to soften his blow. She just sat there, composed, still, sharp as a scalpel. Her expression gave nothing away. Her presence gave everything, and that stillness, that unshaken, quiet focus began to bend the gravity of the room toward her. A young staffer in the back stopped typing mid-sentence, eyes lifting toward Aisha instead of Maddox. A journalist lowered his camera for a beat, suddenly more interested in the woman who wasn't playing along. Even a couple of senators, bored seconds earlier, found themselves watching her more than him. Something was changing. Something Cole Maddox, wrapped tightly in his own narrative, couldn't see. Because when a man expects fear and receives silence instead, the power dynamic begins to crack. The room wasn't reacting the way he'd imagined. No reverent awe, no obvious submission, no triumphant tilt in his favor. Just a slow, steady shift toward her, and the bitter irony. The more Maddox basked in his assumed dominance, the more obvious it became that he was no longer the center of the story. The center of the story was the woman he'd just tried to shrink, long before he leaned over that microphone. Cole Maddox had been busy building a myth to the public. He was the perfect political fantasy. The small-town boy who enlisted straight out of high school, the decorated soldier who came home with medals and scars, the straight-talking senator who told it like it is on every primetime show that would have him. Interviews framed him against flags, stadiums, and factory floors. Back magazine covers called him America's spine, shook hands, posed for photos, and delivered speeches about real people with a practiced grit in his voice. But behind the polished image, another system had quietly grown around him, not just a career, a shield. He built a staff culture that treated disagreement like betrayal. He rewarded loyalty to him over loyalty to the truth. Assistants who questioned his talking points were reassigned. Policy experts who raised concerns about his choices simply stopped being invited back to meetings. He didn't have to threaten anyone. His reputation did it for him. People in the Capitol learned quickly. Cole Maddox liked being admired. He tolerated being feared, but he refused being corrected. Lobbyists loved him. Cable networks couldn't get enough of him. Party donors called him a dream candidate for higher office. So when testimony started quietly circulating about conditions in certain migrant detention facilities, overcrowded cells, untreated medical emergencies, a flu outbreak that had swept through children without basic care, Maddox didn't want that story. It didn't fit the myth. He dismissed initial reports as activist exaggerations. He called internal memos incomplete. Data, he told his staff to get real doctors, not politically motivated ones. When an early version of Dr. Rahman's report landed on his office desk, it never reached his eyes. It was screened, summarized, downplayed, buried under the weight of everything he'd rather talk about, because in his universe, pain that didn't fit his narrative was overblown. Suffering that challenged his speeches was unverified. Human beings became numbers as soon as they complicated his story. He didn't know it then, but one quiet line item in one of those reports, one that carried Aisha's name, would set in motion the chain of events that dragged him here, into this hearing, into this moment, across the table from the woman he'd never bothered to understand.com, prepared, holding evidence that could fracture the myth he'd spent decades protecting. Cole Maddox's influence wasn't going to be tested by a rival, senator, or a political rival. It was about to be tested by the one person he'd never planned for, someone who refused to stay quiet, and he still had no idea. Before she ever sat under the harsh glow of hearing room lights, before her name trended across platforms she didn't even use, before strangers called her the woman who shook a senator, Aisha Rahman was invisible. She grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where the air always smelled like detergent and exhaustion. Her parents, immigrants from Bangladesh, worked double shifts, sending money back home while stretching every dollar. Here, her father drove a taxi at night. Her mother cleaned offices no executive ever saw. They didn't talk about politics. They talked about rent, about the cousin overseas who needed surgery, about overtime, about staying quiet, staying grateful, staying safe. But Aisha noticed things. She noticed how her father's fatigue didn't register as sacrifice the way certain people's did. She noticed how her mother's calloused hands never made it into stories about hardworking Americans. She noticed who got applauded for building the country and who was told they were lucky just to be here. She learned early that fairness wasn't the default, it was something people insisted on, or it never arrived at all. Aisha wasn't loud in school. She wasn't the kid storming into offices demanding change. She was the one who sat in the back, watching, absorbing, connecting dots. Teachers said she was too serious. Guidance counselors suggested she aim for something realistic. When she said she wanted to become a doctor, she aimed higher. She worked weekends, stacking shelves in a grocery store and tutoring kids after class. At night, she studied biology, statistics, public health, ethics, Not the glamorous kind of medicine that ends up on magazine covers, the mundane, critical kind that asked, why do certain people get sick more? Why do certain communities always suffer first and recover last? She became obsessed with patterns, who got help and who didn't. And why, by the time she earned her doctorate in epidemiology from a public university, her name meant almost nothing outside academic journals. But inside those pages, she was building something dangerous to people like Cole Maddox: proof. Real numbers, real patterns, real maps of who was being hurt and who was pretending not to see. Her work eventually landed her inside a government task force quietly assigned to review health conditions in immigration detention centers. It wasn't flashy work. She walked through cramped hallways, inhaled stale air, took notes on overcrowded cells. She listened to mothers describe fevers. She watched guards hand out ibuprofen like it was a miracle drug. She saw paperwork misplaced in reports, delayed. She logged symptoms, timelines, staff shortages, ignored recommendations, and then she saw the mortality data, the numbers. No one could spin children with treatable infections, adults who never received a specialist, asthma attacks gone, unchecked, names replaced by case numbers. That was the moment her life forked into two paths. She could write a mild report that protected her position, softened her findings, and let the system keep rolling. Or she could write what she saw, in detail, without mercy. She chose the second path, the dangerous one. The one nobody expects a soft-spoken woman from a working-class immigrant family to take. And when she submitted that report backed with files, timestamps, internal emails, her trajectory locked onto a collision course with a powerful man who'd built his entire career on claiming to love the very people his decisions harmed. That collision was inevitable, and everyone in that hearing room was about to watch it. Cole Maddox kept talking. Not because the committee needed him to, but because he had never learned how to share the oxygen in a room. He leaned toward the mic like a performer leaning into a spotlight. He invoked his military record. He invoked 9/11s. He invoked chaos at the border. He used phrases like hard choices and tough leadership, the way some people use seasoning over everything, whether it fit or not. Every sentence sounded like it had been rehearsed in a green room. Camera crews swung toward him on reflex. He looked like the center of power, so they treated him like it. But something subtle was happening beneath the noise. A policy aide in the back uncrossed her legs and stared at Aisha instead. A reporter stopped transcribing his words word for word, just listening now. An older senator, who'd tuned out long ago, suddenly leaned forward, studying Aisha's stillness. Maddox didn't notice. He didn't see what the room was seeing. Her silence was growing louder than his speech. Aisha sat perfectly still, hands folded loosely, eyes downcast but awake. It was a posture Maddox read as intimidation. But to anyone paying real attention, it was something else. Control. She waited while he interrupted her name. While he talked about her report without looking at it, while he painted her data as one perspective and his opinion as reality, and with every dismissive flick of his hand, every with all due respect, doctor, more and more faces turned toward her instead of him. He kept mistaking noise for influence. He thought the louder he spoke, the safer he was. He didn't understand that sometimes volume is just the soundtrack to a collapse. The air thickened, heavy with anticipation. A senator tried to direct a question toward Aisha. Maddox jumped in. A journalist tried to reference one of her charts. Maddox clarified the context. And every time he cut her off, he didn't just insult her. He exposed himself. Because the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded. As if he wasn't defending a policy, but defending a story that was starting to slip out of his hands. The room was holding its breath, waiting. Aisha finally lifted her eyes. Just that, but it was enough. One camera shifted focus. Then another. Then another. Now the lenses were on her, not him. For the first time since the hearing began, Cole Maddox felt it. A hairline fracture in his certainty. A pulse ticking in his jaw. The realization that this moment might not be another easy performance. He tried to push through it with more words, but the words began to float, detached, as the room drifted away from him. This story had stopped being about his resume. It was about the person he'd tried to vanish with a single, condescending remark. And she was about to speak. For a heartbeat, the hearing room existed in a strange kind of silence. Technically, Maddox was still talking faster now. And in the real world, but the room wasn't listening anymore. They were waiting for her. Dr. Aisha Rahman raised her head fully, meeting his eyes over the microphones. She didn't adjust her notes, didn't shuffle papers, didn't clear her throat like someone asking permission. She just began. "Senator Maddox," she said quietly. The quiet wasn't weakness. It was a scalpel. The room snapped to attention. "You've said I don't understand national security," she continued, each word precise. "But I've spent the last 4 years inside the detention facilities. Your votes keep open." A few heads turned. Cameras zoomed. She went on. "I've walked into rooms with 50 children sharing 20 beds. I've logged cases where fevers of 104 were treated with water and waiting. I've documented internal emails where medical staff begged for more supplies. And where those requests were denied to avoid bad optics, a low, genuine murmur rippled through the crowd." Maddox shifted in his seat. "Doctor, with all due," she lifted one hand slightly. "Not aggressive, just firm. Senator, please let me finish. You've spoken for nearly 40 minutes. I'll need 3. The line hit the room like a mild earthquake, a beat of stunned silence, then an involuntary chuckle from somewhere in the back. Then the chair of the committee surprisingly nodded. "Go ahead, Dr. Rahman." Maddox's mouth closed. He looked like someone who'd just been told he wasn't the only adult at the table. Aisha continued, unshaken. "You say this is about patriotism. I say it's about documentation." She tapped the stack of papers in front of her. "These are not activist talking points. They are incident reports. They are death certificates. They are internal memos with the names blacked out to protect the people who were terrified to tell the truth." The room, already tense, tightened further. "You talk about hard choices, but the people inside those walls don't have choices at all." Her voice stayed soft. Her words did not. "You've said on television that these facilities are tough, but necessary. So let me be specific. Necessary for whom?" She didn't turn to the senators. She stayed locked on him. Because it wasn't necessary for the 7-year-old whose asthma went untreated for 3 days. It wasn't necessary for the father who died of a heart condition after repeated requests for cardiology care. It wasn't necessary for the woman who gave birth in a cell without a doctor present. Every sentence landed with the weight of something that could be checked, verified, proven. Maddox's face tightened. His fingers laced and unlaced. He searched for an opening to interrupt. There wasn't one. Aisha leaned forward slightly for the first time. "You told me to leave the adult conversations to people who've bled for this flag." Her tone didn't turn sarcastic. If anything, it softened. "I respect your service, Senator. But I need you to understand something. Bleeding for this country is not the only way people sacrifice for it." You could feel the quote forming in real time. "My parents spent decades cleaning its offices and driving its streets at 3 a.m. the children. I met in those centers, left everything they know to reach its borders. The doctors and nurses who came forward risked their careers to tell me these stories." Her eyes didn't leave his. "They're not less patriotic than you because they don't have medals. They're not less American than you because they weren't born here. And they are not less human because their suffering is inconvenient for your talking points." The room exhaled like it had been punched. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, from somewhere behind the press row, a single clap. Then another. Then a handful. The committee chair's gavel came down hard. Order, order. But the room's energy had already changed. Aisha sat back, not triumphant, not smugged, settled. Like someone who had finally placed a heavy truth in the center of the table and was willing to let everyone look at it. She finished quietly. "I'm not here to argue patriotism with you, Senator. I'm here to show you what your version of it has cost. Because the one thing you can't legislate, spin, or bury is the truth recorded in the bodies of the people you choose not to see." Gasps. typed furiously, scribbling fingers. Cameras firing like shutters at a red carpet. Cole Maddox stared straight ahead. Still, but not in control. Because outside that room, a different kind of verdict was already forming. One not written by senators, but by millions of viewers. The clip didn't just circulate. It went off like a flare. Within minutes, the 3-minute exchange from Maddox's adults in the room jabbed to Aisha's calm. Relentless response was ripped from the live feed and posted everywhere. On X, Dr. Rahman didn't raise her voice once. She just burned his entire argument to the ground. On TikTok, edits with slow zooms of Maddox's face when the committee chair said, "Let her speak." Text overlays. When the quiet one ends the whole performance. On Instagram, split-screen reels, Maddox talking over her. Then Aisha raising her hand with, "You've spoken for 40 minutes. I'll need 3. Tag took off almost instantly. Hashtag let her finish. Then another. Hashtag adults in the room by midnight. Dr. Rahman was trending above celebrity names and movie premieres. Reaction channels posted breakdowns. This is how you handle a bully in power. Political commentators called it the moment his brand cracked in real time. A veteran tweeted, "As someone who served, I'm tired of politicians like Maddox weaponizing our service to silence civilians. That doctor is more patriotic than half this town." Nurses, social workers, teachers, and detention staff started sharing their own anonymous stories. Threads multiplied. "I've seen this. She's not exaggerating. We were told not to put certain things in writing. There's so much more." Watchdog groups stitched her testimony into their campaigns. Advocacy organizations clipped her line. "Bleeding for this country is not the only way people sacrifice for it," and turned it into posters, banners, and profile pictures. For the first time in his long career, Cole Maddox's name trended not next to the word hero, but next to the word exposed. And yet, the biggest impact didn't live online. It lived in people. In the girl in a public school classroom who'd been told she was too intense when she challenged a teacher. In the immigrant dad who'd been talked over in city meetings by officials who claimed to speak for his community. In the nurse who'd been dismissed by a hospital board more interested in profit than patient safety. They saw something they didn't get to see often. A powerful man tried to reduce a woman to footnote, and failed. Not because she shouted him down. Not because she humiliated him with insults, but because she refused to surrender the truth. She carried. She showed that dignity wasn't passive. It wasn't fragile, it was force. She proved that expertise doesn't always arrive in the loudest voice. That patriotism doesn't always get announced from podiums. That courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it says, "You've spoken for 40 minutes. I'll need 3. And then it uses those 3 minutes to change how a country sees itself. One exchange in a hearing room, a smirk, an insult. A 3-minute reply turned into something. Bigger than a partisan clash, it became a mirror. Cole Maddox tried to put her in her place. Instead, he revealed where he'd been standing all along. On one side, entitlement, image, power that assumes it never has to listen. On the other, integrity, evidence. A woman who'd walked through the consequences of his choices and refused to look away. He walked into that room sure he'd dominate the story. He left his aside, character in hers, and for everyone who's ever been underestimated, talked down to, or treated like their perspective didn't count because it didn't come with medals, titles, or a wealthy last name. The message landed: you don't have to shout to be undeniable. You don't need permission to speak truth. And you are never as small as someone in power needs you to feel, because sometimes all it takes to shake a giant is one calm voice that refuses to disappear.